Hi, my name is Jim Dillingham, and welcome to part one of a 5-part series on optimizing your staffing level. Today, in part one, we're going to talk about the cost of your labor options. So let's start with the obvious one, which is straight time. To make good decisions about how much straight time you should have, we need to accurately cost out that straight time. So when we look at a cost, we look at not only at the hourly rate, but we look at how much does it cost us to pay for vacations? How much are we paying for holidays? How much are we paying for health care, pension plan? How much are we paying for payroll taxes, etc.? So there are a lot of things that go into paying that 1 hour straight time above and beyond what the hourly rate is. As a rule of thumb, if you're paying $20 an hour, you should consider the cost of that $20 to be about $30 to the company once it is properly and fully loaded. Another type of labor option is overtime. Interestingly, overtime is just a little bit more expensive than straight time. Overtime, the cost of overtime consists of the hourly rate times time and a half times some small percentage, which rate basically accounts for payroll taxes. This usually is about 10% once you throw in any residual thing such as 401k matching, etc. So overtime is generally slightly more expensive than straight time, but within maybe a 5 to 10% range. I've actually done projects where overtime, an hour of overtime, is cheaper than an hour of straight time. As a rule of thumb, you can consider the cost of straight time and the cost of overtime to be equal. The reason you can do this is because overtime, although it may cost just a little bit more, generally relieves you of the obligation to hire and train more people. And it can be used in very small, handy increments, 15 minutes of overtime as opposed to hiring somebody for 40 hours a week. So overtime and straight time, as a company, you should say they cost us about the same. They both give us the same amount of value per dollar. Another typical cost of time that we need to look at is temporary labor. Temporary labor is usually about 50% as expensive as full-time labor. Good news about it is it's cheap. Another good news is that it's flexible. You can let temps come and go on a daily basis or even a half a shift basis. Temporary labor has a downside to it. That downside being that temporary employees, one, tend to have much less skills than full-time employees, and two, they have a much higher turnover rate. Every time you turn somebody over that you've trained, those skills walked out the door. The skills that you paid for that person to acquire walk out the door and they don't come back. So the quality and the turnover are very expensive things that are very tough to put into a calculator, but you can certainly try, and you'll find that straight-time labor is generally cheaper overall than full-time labor. When we look at the cost of temporary labor at an overtime rate, the picture changes a little bit. If we take a full-time employee, look at what it costs to pay them straight time, and look what it costs to pay them overtime. As I mentioned, this cost is about the same. When you look at a temporary employee, the cost of paying for that temporary employee at straight time and the cost of paying for that temporary employee at time and a half, the difference is 50%. It costs 50% more to pay for an hour of temporary labor at the overtime rate than it does at the straight time rate. So make sure when you're comparing all of your options, we're looking at full-time employees at straight time, full-time employees at overtime, temporary employees at straight time, and temporary employees at overtime. And finally, we want to look at the lack of work option. Lack of work comes from when you choose a staffing level that is too high for some particular reason. Maybe there's some seasonality to the work, and you elect to staff high to accommodate that seasonal work. And then when the workload goes away for part of the week or a slow season, then you lay people off. You may send them home for a day, or you may send them home for a weekend or a week of something of that nature. If you send them home for a long enough period, then we don't worry about it. That becomes a unemployment benefit cost, which is a slightly different cost. But if we just send somebody home today because we have a lack of work, and we do that on a routine basis, this is a little bit different accounting math. So when we send somebody home, we saved their wages, but we didn't keep them from earning future vacation. We didn't keep them from earning future holiday benefits. We didn't cut back on their medical expenses. So you'll find that when you send somebody home, the cost of that hour that you would have paid if they were there dropped by about 75%, but it didn't drop by 100%. There's still costs being incurred. So if we take a look at this, we have the 5 different types of labor. Straight time wages, what's it cost? Overtime wages of a full-time employees, temporary employees at straight time, temporary employees at overtime, and we also have the lack of work. Now, one thing I didn't really mention was overtime at a double time rate. Overtime at a double time rate, without a doubt, is going to be more expensive than every other labor option you have. So keep that in mind. You should do the math. I typically recommend that companies that have double time place it in a place, not that it saves them money, they put double time in a place where it sends a signal that an employee's maybe worked too many hours in a week. So double time has a role. You should know how much it costs, and you should really try not to use very much of it, but it can be used as a signal that maybe your employees are being overworked under certain circumstances. Okay, this is the end of the part 1 on optimal staffing levels. Look forward to part 2 coming up in the next few days.